My name's Rana Mitter, and I teach the history and politics of modern China at Oxford University. I'm the author of China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism, an examination of how nationalist ideology is shaping the rise of the world's most, how can you put it, exciting, but also in some ways troubling new power. But I'm here today to talk to Parag Khanna, one of the most interesting and innovative geopolitical thinkers that we have working in the world today. He's speaking to me from his base in Singapore, where he's been rather unusually confined for the last few months, because normally he's very much a global traveler. But he has had time to get out a new book recently, The Future is Asian, which is a volume that looks at the changing economic and social patterns around the world. And he's also been thinking a great deal about the question of smart cities, which of course is very much the topic that we're going to be following today. So between us, we'll take about 20 minutes or so just to chat through some of the issues on which Parag is very expert. Parag, welcome, and I think you're going to appear before us right now.
Hello, Rana. So good to see you again.
Very good to see you too, and I'm glad that the long distance between Oxford and Singapore in our two cases has not divided us. So much to cover, and obviously a very limited time, but I know that cities and the way they've changed is something that you've been thinking about in different modes for a very long time. Could I ask my first question and indulge myself actually as a historian by asking the following? Everything that we're going to be talking about, of course, happens in the shadow of COVID. And we have over the centuries seen plagues hit cities before. London back in 1665. Cholera, of course, changed the way that water was supplied in some of the cities of the West, Hamburg, for instance, in the 19th century. My question to you is there anything distinctive about the way that COVID-19 has changed the cities of our era? Or in wider perspective, is it actually part of a much longer, in some ways quite familiar process?
Oh, it's a great question, Ron. I think there are several answers to it. The first is that there has been this false dichotomy created between the idea of the city losing because of COVID and the identification of this term, the city, with New York and Los Angeles, as if those two cities are representative of what is happening in all cities. And the truth is that, as you know, across space and time, there is always a relentless competition among cities to attract talent. So it's not that the city wins or loses, it's which cities are winning and losing as a result of something like a pandemic, the consequences of a pandemic, or remote work and technologies, shifting affordability and cost of living factors, climate change, and so on. All of these factors are always operating simultaneously in tandem. So it's not, the city never loses, right? The question is just which cities. And then specific, I think across different geographies there are different answers. Whereas right now, it's something of a foregone conclusion that many people who can afford to, those in the services industry who can do remote work, will move towards areas where they can have a larger plot of land and a better work-life balance and all of these kinds of things. But that's not really true in Asia, because of course the disparities are so vast, inequality is very high, the quality of life and access to good education and healthcare and other public services is so far higher in the first tier cities than in the second tier or third tier, that people will still do whatever it takes to move into the city. So I think, by and large, this sort of notion of a bucolic suburbanization is not really going to be a big trend here in Asia.
No, I think that's certainly true. And since we brought up the subject of the Asian city, which is a very distinctive sort of development in historical terms, let's stick with that for a few minutes before we get to the subject of smart cities, which of course is the focus of our discussion today. I know that you've been working recently on migration patterns and human flows, more broadly speaking. In fact, I may be not giving away too much to say that at some point you may have another book coming out on the subject. But let's talk about COVID and the effect on that, because in the short term, it has restricted the way that people move between cities. I mean, the city you're sitting in now, Singapore, is one of the great cities built by migration over the centuries, and yet it probably has fewer people coming in or coming out of that city in the last half year than has been the case perhaps for the last 200 years. Is this a fundamental change to the way in which migration is going to happen in places, in hubs like Singapore?
Maybe, maybe not. It may depend on the standard of living, right? And also what is sui generis about Singapore is that it is an island. So it's not a situation like Bangkok, which is so centrally located. It's still going to be a hub for people flowing in and out within the country or from its immediate neighbors. That has certainly been immediately cut off and shut down in Singapore in ways that are not possible when a country is not there's a great civil servant here named Peter Ho, who says it's CSI Singapore, like the TV show, but he says it's city, state, island, that's a particular, kind of circumstance here. But I think that, again, we have to think about this not in the context of holding all else equal and then asking this question. And what I mean by all else is technology. Because, of course, technology and the ways in which we do or practice or enable migration, immunity passports may come in, there are biometrics, blockchain, all of these kinds of technologies that will rapidly be deployed now will allow for people to move between countries in general, and certainly between cities in particular, cities being the places that, and Singapore is not an exception here, depend to a large degree on the flows of talent in and out, traders, migrants, and so forth. So I think that the demand for restoring those flows is so high that the technological solutions are going to kick in very soon.
We're going to get to technology in even more detail in just a moment or so, but let me just bring in one other element to do with that sense of migration through cities in Asia before we get to that question, because in a sense, the technology is more universal than some of the other issues. The issue I'm thinking here actually is what you might call the kind of ecology in which people exist with each other. Now, Singapore is distinctive in some ways, not just for being an island, but of course, it is an English-speaking city. And that, of course, gives it huge amounts of international cogency. Now, one of the peculiarities of the rise of China, and I think we can't talk about Asia without bringing China into the equation in some ways, is that we have a very large, essentially non-Anglophone society, which is taking a much bigger chunk of the world's attention when it comes to everything from global governance, which you, of course, also have written about in the past, to, of course, questions of technological innovation in places like Shenzhen, Hangzhou, and, of course, Haidian and regions of Beijing. How much do you think a barrier or not, or lack of barriers are there in some of those questions to do with language and culture in the region? Asia's a small world for a big region, which has an awful lot of differentiation within it, after all.
It has enormous diversity, and I think we can link this to the pandemic in the sense that, as with other regions, to the extent there is international mobility, it is very much regionally restricted. And I think one of the probably long-standing effects of COVID will be that, whereas in any case migration has been more regional than global, that will be ever more the case. And so the circulation of people within Asia, students, tourists, business travelers, is going to focus much more on this immediate region. So that applies obviously to Chinese who have returned to China, and in China's case now circulating much more domestically, which has been very good for their economic recovery. Countries in Asia trying very hard to lure more Chinese tourists and Indian tourists and so forth, again, to compensate for what's happening globally in terms of this continental drift and regionalism that's affecting the world. What I do see by and large, again, Asians travel 3 times more within Asia than outside the region, right? And if that was 75-25, it could very well become 90-10. Let's say, in the years ahead. And that, of course, is going to benefit population-rich regions that use technology seamlessly to enable safe mobility across borders, that simultaneously have passed trade agreements like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that was signed just 2 weeks ago, and all of these other steps that Asians are doing to basically take advantage of each other's, or to take advantage of the demographic and skills complementarities that they have. So despite the incredible, dizzying diversity of Asia, you are seeing a significant uptick in mobility and migration. And I would attribute this to something, Rana, that I know you would appreciate. It's that Asian civilizations actually are so large as cultural, demographic zones that they don't really have that. Their jealousies of each other may be economic and geopolitical, but not cultural. So they do not have to fear cultural dilution per se, the way one has had in the case of European neighborly rivalries in the past.
Although one could look at it the other way and say that perhaps there would be more opportunity for cultural hybridity between them, because of course mixtures can also be very positive as well as negative in that.
In fact, I'm glad you mentioned that, because the entire region of Southeast Asia, is nothing if not a hybrid of Chinese, Indian, Javanese, broadly various civilization strains that have come together over the centuries with, as you mentioned at the outset, a very important colonial layer. And that has, given the region certain commonalities. And I think that, again, there's a comfort level with those layers here in this region that I find to be an important part of its overall societal resilience or kind of regional diplomatic resilience.
So let's use that to bring us very naturally to the question of smart cities and the city that you're sitting in, Singapore. Now, I've heard frequently that Singapore may be the smartest city in the world. I hear that quite often from Singaporeans, I have to say, who tend to be somewhat proud of their own hometown, and fair enough in many ways. Rather than boosterism, granularity is always good. For those who are watching who perhaps don't know Singapore well, could you just give an example or two of everyday life and how it is living in a city which actually displays so many of the characteristics of what's thought of as the typical connected, wired, smart city?
I will say as a caveat, there are in specific areas countries that are, more cashless, have, more in the realm of digital payments and this kind of thing. But in terms of the overall experience as an everyday resident of a country, it's hard to be in a smarter place than this, in the sense that it's not just about technology. I mean, one of the cardinal mistakes really when people are making these assessments is to focus overly on the kind of whiz-bang, of certain technologies. But the truth is that the availability of quality healthcare is an indicator of smartness, access to public information and data, the transparency with which the government rolled out the Trace Together contact tracing app during COVID. All of this around public communications. All of that, that's all part of smartness.
How much, though, of what we see in Singapore, and for those who haven't visited, it's a fantastic place, which I highly recommend going to, but how much of the phenomena you're talking about, great healthcare, socialized housing and so forth, is a product of one other undeniable fact about Singapore, which is that it's relatively wealthy? In other words, Asia, if we're sticking to that region, has many great cities, Bangkok, Manila, and other places, which frankly have much, much greater diversity of riches and poverty. And it's much harder to imagine those as becoming smart cities in that sense anytime soon. So is wealth a prerequisite, or is it a product of the policies?
Well, in fact, as you know, Rana, Singapore was very poor 60 years ago. So its wealth is not a prerequisite. Singapore's wealth is man-made, so to speak. It's not a sort of a factor endowment issue. The population has grown on the basis of immigration, but it really was smart government that created the conditions that have made this country wealthy, and other countries have sort of squandered it. Now, I think the difference is sort of initial conditions, if you will, because now as these larger, poorer countries seek to make their cities smart, let's take a Jakarta or a Manila or a Bangkok as the examples you just mentioned. It's very difficult to take that legacy infrastructure, the enormous, with the population size and the density that they have right now, and suddenly start from scratch. You cannot start from scratch in cities like that. And so I think they'll face an uphill battle. And this is precisely why, actually, in the case of Jakarta, they have, the Indonesian government has decided that it's going to move the entire capital and create a new city in the middle of the jungle in Borneo, and that will now be the capital of Indonesia, because they know that they cannot take a city with 25 million people. Quite frankly, no one knows what the actual population of Jakarta is, right? You will never turn that place, as it sinks, by the way, due to climate change, into a smart city. And which brings me, by the way, to a point about smartness. When it comes to Singapore, they have a $100 billion 50-year climate change plan. Right? You can see the construction of sea barriers and the elevation of roads and the things that they've done with water reservoir and water recycling and catchment and all of these kinds of things. Now, acceleration also of hydroponic and aquaponic food production. These are all infrastructural aspects of smartness, where the government here has thought about this 10 years ago and acted on a 20 or 30-year plan.
Should those of us who worry about both security of the country and personal civil liberties be worried from what we see in Singapore about the smartening of the city? Is it smarter, but is it also more constricted?
Well, on the first point, that is where wealth actually does play a role. Now that Singapore is rich, it can actually, for example, in the case of 5G, build its own 5G base and then invite foreign telecommunications companies, whether it's Huawei or others, or rather the actual telecom companies, to bid on licenses. Other countries cannot afford to actually build their base and therefore are reliant on Huawei because it is cheaper than others. So that's where wealth comes in. So in other words, preserving infrastructural sovereignty, if you will, that is very critical part of Singapore's strategy to maintain its diplomatic autonomy. And obviously I encourage other countries to try to do that if they can. We're seeing in the Western conversation, we've seen this in Australia, we're seeing it in Germany and in the US, government saying, you know what, maybe we do need to have certain restrictions around what people can say in for example, in the internet space and in social media, because, sort of fake news and these kinds of things can actually be disruptive to anyone's definition of the, minimum degree of law and order that even in a free society, governments now...
But should we worry about freedoms as well?
No question. Again, no question. So, but the issues, I'm seeing much more of a tendency in our Western conversation to lean in the Singaporean direction than I'm seeing the other way around. What's happening right now with fake news is, for at least for people in Singapore, is really validating their model rather than challenging it.
And in the last few seconds, and very briefly, please, we are coming to a place where, as you say in your latest book, the future is Asian. If there's one brief lesson for the rest of the world from Asia on the smart cities question, what would that lesson be?
Well, I guess build. What we've noticed is that the Western societies, even countries like Germany that have had the highest quality infrastructure traditionally, have let that decay. But infrastructure is something that has to constantly be nurtured and upgraded. And that's what Asian countries are doing now, whether it is countries with a very high fixed capital formation like Singapore, or even the poorer countries. The share of federal budgets in Asia that's being directed towards new infrastructure, the latest standards, leapfrogging, if you will, is very, very high. And that's something that the whole world needs to follow.
Parag Khanna, it's always a pleasure to talk to you and to get a glimpse of the future. Thank you very much for joining us here today on CogX. And now back to Joy.